Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest is Thomas Licker. He's the president of American Biorecovery Association. They work with biohazardous and hazardous materials. So I think this will be really interesting to see what they can do with them instead of just disposing of them.
Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate you having us.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background. How did you get into this industry?
Well, it was a little bit by accident. I came to the industry when I was in college and at university. I studied environmental science, and pretty much has everything to do with soil, groundwater, air, building, how buildings breathe, and HVAC systems and industrial hygiene. And I went to work for the first job that I got out of college. I went to work for the US EPA and as a contractor. And so I had my tour of duty with the Region 3 Superfund removal program, taking care of some of the worst sites that were on the national priority list to be remediated. And eventually I ended up in private practice, dealing with a lot of different engineering firms and cleaning up groundwater especially. And I moved out to New Jersey because 70% of my business at the time was coming out of the east to Delaware River Valley. And I went to work for a restoration firm that had a hazmat and environmental cleanup division. And, one day we had a spill that we had to respond to, and it was with a medical waste truck that had just removed all the medical waste from the pathology lab at a hospital. And we had a mix of red bag biohazard and diesel fuel all over the ground. And that's the day that we decided that we should probably get into the biohazard response industry. And initially I wanted nothing to do with it. I thought it was disgusting. I thought it would, it turned a lot of people green. But the more we learned about it, the more we grasped the concept that nobody should ever have to clean up the remains of a loved one. And it became a passion. It became something that when we looked at the final outcome of how we could help people in a very desperate time of need.
So these are crime scene cleanups?
Yes. Crime scene cleanup, suicide, murder, illicit drug use. And that's what we're running into a lot right now. We're dealing with a lot of fentanyl overdoses. So, with that said, it is not just blood. It's not just bodily fluids that we can run into, but we can run into all sorts of hazards and a variety of different hazards, and how these hazards travel through a building and how they cross-contaminate hallways, bedrooms, kitchens is amazing. With that said, even some of the latest infectious diseases that are rearing their ugly heads, such as C. diff and VRE, some of the gastrointestinal pathogens that we respond to as well as when we have a public health crisis, we assist states, municipalities, federal government, and emergency response actions regarding biohazard incidents. So, it's a necessary service in the current world, and it's an important service. Not everybody is cut out to do this stuff.
So what changed your mind where you decided to go into it?
Well, it was lucrative. It made sense as it just kind of dovetailed our hazardous materials team, and it was a value added. And what really made us get into the business was when you got that hug at the end of the day, when you were there and you mitigated, and kept people from getting re-victimized. That's the biggest thing. When somebody commits suicide or there's a murder or what have you, you're just not the machine that goes in and cleans up. You have to deal with the next of kin. You have to deal with the insurance adjuster. You have to deal with the families sometimes. And in the event that there is a tragic event, who's authorized to sign the contract for the cleanup? So all that has to, you have to think of all that ahead of the game and ahead of responding. The next of kin and who's the executor of the estate, all those types of questions need to be answered, as well as risk assessment questions. What are we subjecting our team to as they're making an entry into that space? So there's so many variables, different levels of response. If you ever watched the movie Outbreak, they have different levels of laboratories where things are studied in. Or if you look at the CDC website and, ask what a biosafety level is, we could be responding to any one of 4 level hazards, which go from 1 to 4, the 1 being the least risk to 4 being the maximum risk. So whether it's Ebola or if it's a common cold or flu bug, which really doesn't have a surface significance, or they don't really live outside of the body, that would be considered a level 1. Now, with that said, there are a lot of misconceptions regarding response to bio, because a lot of people don't know these types of hazards. They don't understand the transmission risks associated with certain pathogens. And our goal as an association is to provide contractors that have this capability the gold standard in certification, credentialing, and education. We also vet contractors according to, are they properly insured? Do they have a respiratory protection program? Do they have a exposure control plan? Are they current with the OSHA requirements to be in business? And the association has been around for close to 30 years now, and we've always remained the gold standard, and we've remained relatively small. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who get into this business thinking that they're going to make millions of dollars when you have no requirements really, other than they think all they need is a bloodborne pathogen card, which you can go online and get in 2 hours. So, there aren't really any barriers to entry, but OSHA does have their requirements for this type of work. And, one of them includes hazardous waste operations and emergency response training, which is 40 hours. And but we here in our industry as well, I can't train people enough to justify, or I can't keep people long enough to justify that level of training.
What's involved in the job? So you're called in for a scene where there's a biohazard. What has to be done when you go to the location? What's some of the prep work, and what happens at the scene?
Well, front-end management on the front end, okay? We send everybody through a BSRA, which is our recovery site risk assessment, and we're evaluating what's there by asking certain questions, such as what did the person die of? And a lot of people will name a syndrome such as sepsis, but what caused the sepsis? And what microorganism may we have to target? Is it a shooting? One of the biggest questions that we get is we don't want people calling us and say, hey, I need a cleanup, and then we're assisting in the crime by cleaning up something that hasn't been cleared by the police. So we always ask, who's the detective that referred you, and their phone number, so we can make sure that the scene has been cleared for cleanup. We could be aiding and abetting if we don't ask those questions. And what type of PPE, how protected do we need to be when we're entering these types of sites? sometimes we need an extended contamination study, especially if there's an illicit drug involved and they were either manufacturing, cutting, or using in that space. And how far did the contamination go? How far was it dragged? Is it in the HVAC system? So sometimes there's upfront sampling that needs to be done so we can pinpoint or at least get a good guess at where the majority of the contamination may be found in a dwelling.
Oh, so if you just send your guys into a scene, yeah, they could get very sick or injured from the stuff that's there.
They could die, and they could also bring that stuff home with them to their families. So we need to really, it's a whole other level of respect for the risks associated with this job. Very similar to first responders. Sometimes we don't know the risks associated. If somebody calls in and, somebody's has decomposed, what are the risks associated with the gastrointestinal and other types of body fluids that may be present? Did they have HIV? And we just take universal precautions to make sure that our workers are protected going into these situations. Not only that, sometimes you have dried bodily fluids, and if you disturb them, you can aerosolize them, and that causes increased cross-contamination issues.
So there's dangers from the bodies themselves?
Yes.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
So what's an example of a cleanup scene that was very precarious without giving too many revealing details? What's an example?
Such as we had an incident that's where we had an OD. The coroner medical examiner came, removed the body, and it was fentanyl related. And so the client calls us and says, well, I need a quote. And so we let him know that it was a class 4 BSRA project and that sampling would have to be done, and that a clearance report would also have to be written by a third-party consultant, because we're primarily the cleanup contractor. We go in there, we perform the mitigation, and you always need a clearance or to reoccupy that space. And those reports are generally done by a third-party consultant. Well, we put all our numbers together, and then they were like, forget it. And then his roommate went up there to try and grab some stuff out of the apartment in the whole midst of it, and he ended up getting exposure to fentanyl in some way, and they found his body a couple days later.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really? Just breathing it in? What
you could touch it, you can ingest it, and you could touch your soft tissues with it, and you can OD. It's that powerful.
Really?
Yes.
Holy cow.
People aren't.
I've heard of car fentanyl and stuff that's like 100 times stronger than fentanyl, as well. I wish there's even nastier stuff out there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we don't have the ability to detect what type of opioid it is. So it could be carfentanil, which is an elephant tranquilizer, and it could be something that dangerous. The whole situation with the opioid crisis right now is just a shame. It's an absolute, it could be stopped. But the problem with it is that as this stuff is getting synthesized in Mexico and brought across the border, it's able to be stored in small cellophane packages and actually shipped through the U.S. mail undetected because it's so potent, small amounts.
So if this is shipped wrong, it could kill mail carriers, it could kill postal workers, it could kill anyone in a house that picks up the mail. I mean, is that what you're saying?
If there's a breached package, yes. So there's evidence of that, and we'll tell you how potent the product is. I don't know if you remember, but back in the early 90s, when the Russians had the Chechen rebels take a whole school hostage. There are reports that they use fentanyl in the food that they sent in, and it brought that situation to its knees. And I'm not sure how many they revived, because I don't know if even Narcan was around back then. So that's our big...
Here's a question. So, all right, if someone is at a scene, one of your guys, and they inhale fentanyl, will they know, and can they use anything to stop themselves from dying? Like, how fast will they be incapacitated?
Yes, yeah. You don't die right away, okay? The problem with it is that even some of us are going into these sites, and you could have drug users or people that have been microdosed or exposed over a period of time that have a tolerance, and we don't. So with that said, everybody on my team is trained to deliver Narcan. And if there is an exposure event where somebody's, and you'll know, because somebody will all of a sudden get really tired, because it attacks the nervous system and your opioid receptors. So it will knock you down, and you'll basically, it'll tranquilize you and knock you out. I mean, that's what these things do. So with that said, to have your team or your staff at the ready, and we have to have a minimum of 2 entrants into the space and 1 as a observer or attendant outside of the decon chamber. And everybody's always in communication with each other with radios, hand radios, as we're going in. And we want to make sure that everybody comes out safe and everybody gets decontaminated properly. This is OSHA HAZWOPER training 101. I mean, we do this according to the law and our training. So with that said, and unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there in the world that will claim to do this just for the benefit of the dollar. And you have to be very, very careful who you hire to do this type of work, without having an industrial hygienist involved on the front end and the back end of these projects to delineate the contamination on the front end and close the case on the back end. You're doing a disservice to the property owner. So with that said, we run into some really precarious situations in this industry, and you have to be on the lookout for it. And it's as simple as really communication with the first responders and getting that upfront sampling done.
So what do you, again, what's an example? What do you sample at a crime scene?
Crime scene sampling, mostly what we're looking for is illicit drugs, especially if there's evidence of drug use on site. We'll be sampling for synthetic opioids and primarily methamphetamine. So anything that's really a synthetic, as traditional illicit drugs such as cocaine and heroin or what have you, present themselves as a much lower risk. So we're looking for the high risk items that may impact the property and may impact the future inhabitants.
Like what and how?
I just said we're looking for fentanyl and methamphetamine primarily.
So is meth as bad as fentanyl? Like it can be volatilized in the air and will it make people sick for a long period of time, or what's that story?
Methamphetamine has been with us for a while. And, as they're cooking or baking, just like in Breaking Bad, you can have the meth crystallization and the amphetamine impacting drywall. It does become aerosolized, and it can impact an entire house or dwelling. So, the biggest things with, cookhouses or, the shaking and baking process is the cross-contamination of amphetamine throughout a space. And it could be really detrimental to the building. Sometimes buildings need an entire gut in order to really bring that space back to something that could be reoccupied safely.
You ever have to also do like asbestos testing? What if there's a drug use scene with an overdose inside an old building?
Oh yeah. So if everything that we would have to remove as part of the mitigation would have to be sampled for asbestos prior to removal. And we have to consider anything prior to 1978 for possible lead paint. So we can have, contaminants, historic legacy contaminants associated with a body fluid project where you have cross-contamination from body fluids that could, spread throughout a a structure, especially the subfloors and what have you, for where the body was found. Also, if there's insect activity, where do the insects possibly carry that contamination? Because it's really hard to get the odors out unless you really do a solid and proper job, which can be invasive at times.
It's crazy. I don't even know if it's a good idea even to say it, but has anyone tried to set a trap for companies like yours, or for law enforcement, or for crime scene cleanup, where they have a scene deliberately with hazardous stuff there to try to, sicken or kill the people that come to clean it up?
I haven't personally run into anything like that, but we always have to keep our guard up when we're making an entrance into these spaces. And we also have to be careful where we're doing some of this work, because some of the neighborhoods where this happens, sometimes there's gang activity, and if you're cleaning up something that and you're part of the restoration team, they get very territorial and inquisitive about the processes and procedures of of what you're doing. So maybe they could do it themselves and get themselves out of trouble, or if people, what chemical you're using. And how do you get that blood out?
It's crazy. Any other examples? Maybe not fentanyl, but other situations that were really hairy for strange reasons.
Yeah, we had a suicide with a young man that bought the chemical that sets airbags off, and it is shock sensitive. So it takes electrical charge to set it off, and you get rapid expansion of the chemical. And he had bought this through the black market somewhere, and he was playing with it. I don't even know if he knew what it really was. And there's the static electricity that set off the charge, and we had that all over a room. Some of it was, of course, used up in the reaction, but we had both, a bodily fluid scene to clean up, and we had a potential hazardous material incident on top of that. So, and another one was where a university professor decided to take her own life and bought a jar of potassium cyanide to a hotel with her. And and she ended up taking her own life, but the first responders she had the jar stored under the side of the bed, and the first responders showed up and actually accidentally kicked the bottle over. And so we had potassium cyanide with a decomp on top of that. So there are situations.
What did he have to do?
We had to go in there, with we had to vacuum up everything with HEPA vacuums, and that's when you take anything that has a high hazard contamination event, and you're vacuuming this stuff up. And you better check that HEPA vacuum to make sure that, with a laser particle counter, to make sure that you are truly getting HEPA level filtration. Same thing with fentanyl or other types of high hazard particulates. The highest concentration is going to be in that vacuum bag or that vacuum filter. And it's always best to consider sending that whole vacuum cleaner, drum it up, and sending it off as overclassified medical waste for incineration.
That's what I was going to say. What happens to the clothes you guys wear? What happens to the filters and the canisters and all this? Does it all have to be incinerated after each job, or can it be cleaned?
No, we incinerate it.
So it all has to be disposed. Otherwise, I guess you can get scene-to-scene contamination and just all kinds of problems, right?
Yeah. So it's sometimes, we also have to file if it's a hazardous material, such as a cyanide or what have you. We also have to consider that as hazardous waste under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So everything from the job site gets tracked cradle to grave for, those types of substances. Now, so shockingly, fentanyl or other types of drugs of that nature are not listed as a RCRA waste stream. So we send it off as overclassified waste for incineration, and everything gets drummed up or boxed up as medical waste, and it is sent off and tracked in similar fashion to RCRA. So it is a fantastically rewarding business to be in, to help people out.
How do you feel that you're helping people out? Maybe it's a stupid question. Who are you helping?
That's a good question. The next of kin, the executor of the estate, we're preventing them from really getting re-victimized. Because every time they would walk into that space, they would walk into that house, they could either smell it or visually see the staining. And that could be their uncle, that could be, and we've had people that have tried to clean up after a loved one. And mentally, it could crack a lot of people.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Hey, it's terrible.
It's a terrible thing to happen to somebody, but it is when you're done and they hug you and they say, I never hope to have your services again. That's okay with me. I hope I don't get repeat clients, but we have, unfortunately.
Really? Why?
Mental health running through the family, mental health reasons running through the family where we've had multiple suicides or there was a suicide murder. And so it does happen.
What happens after you're done with the cleanup? Do you have like a truck or a staging area where the guys take off all their garments and then they have like a chemical shower and they change into other clothes to leave the scene?
Yeah.
But all that stuff gets...
Yeah. For class 4 projects, we have a 3-stage decontamination unit, and they take everything through there to prevent cross-contamination from the workspace into the public space. So it is a process. It's similar to any type of hazmat situation, and that's where we really borrowed it from. We borrowed it from hazmat. We borrowed it from the asbestos abatement industries. They were doing it first, and we said, "Wow, this is a good idea, and we need to incorporate this as a methodology for making sure that and mitigating the risks to keep people safe and people and their loved ones when they go home safe as well." So it's a huge responsibility to do things and do it right. And that's what the association is there for. Whether people use the association or not, or, it is, I've learned more from the experiences all the way from when a couple of Abra companies did the 9/11 anthrax attack decon at the Hart Building, all the way through handling the Ebola crisis and assisting hospitals in the cleanup and of patients that we're eliminating during their process of infection. So it can be a very rewarding job, but it can also be a very tough job, both mentally and physically.
What happened with COVID? Did everything turn into a COVID cleanup now and you had to go do those, or is that just, how is it treated?
Well, we did those, but we also stipulated that enveloped respiratory virus is very highly unlikely to have surface transmission. We didn't say it wasn't possible, but it was very unlikely. But they still wanted us to go in as a perception show, basically to make everybody feel better that a third party was conducting that decontamination work. So, with that said, when you're an association that's been around for 30 years, the expertise that has been built over that time, especially we have people going back and forth in between pharma, biosafety, and other types of industries into ours, as well as first responders, EMTs that have started their own biorecovery companies. The knowledge is with the association, and knowledge is power. So when we have conferences or educational offerings, the experience is second to none. The other thing too is we are really trying to protect the consumer as the American Biorecovery Association, because there's so many people out there, like I said, that get a bloodborne pathogen card and are waving that and claiming that they're a professional. And that's probably the scariest thing that about our industry is there's not much enforcement, and there's not much there's not much it takes to get into it.
So what do you see as the future? What new kinds of cleanups or things are coming, or what new protocols you're looking at going forward?
Well, there are a wide variety of variables that could hit our door at any day. One of them include epidemics or pandemics, such as COVID, where you have a novel virus. We have non-envelope viruses, which are very tiny viruses, such as norovirus and others that could mutate and change any day and become, the next, epidemic or pandemic. And those are the things that, the biosecurity team, CDC, the universities are doing a good job trying to protect the human population for something like that happening. Anything can come back. Any of our childhood, back in the day, we had polio virus. We had a wide range of exposure events to stuff that had a very high transmission rate from person to person, or from surfaces to person. So, with that said, what does the future hold? Sometimes we don't know. And we are a reactive. We try to be as proactive with our training and education as possible, but we are a reactive society. And, prevention is the key, I think. And there are so many variables to help prevent, suicide and other things, and, teaming up with other nonprofits to help mitigate those conditions is something that is always in the back of our heads. So, with that said, there's so many different things out there that, whether it's maintaining biosafety labs, working in pharma, there are a lot of things that biorecovery companies can do to be viable, sustainable, and help diversify their income portfolios. And we are always teaming up with other organizations such as the American Biosafety Association, the IAQA, Indoor Air Quality Association, and we cross-pollinate ideas and brainstorm ideas to help each of our associations move forward. And I think that being a part of that, can only help improve the value that our members provide the public.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. I appreciate you having me.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.